Thank you guys for coming today. My name is Jenny Morris. I work with the Autism Society of Alabama, and we are excited to be hosting some new Zoom meetings for parents called Hands In. We hope that these meetings help during this time that we're all at home with our kids and homeschooling or accidental homeschooling and parenting and working all at the same time. So I have sent everybody an email with the notes that our speaker has sent us today. Her name is Nancy Barnes, and I will go ahead and introduce her right now. Nancy Barnes is a retired former special ed teacher, autism specialist for the Huntsville City Schools, and just we're happy to have her today. She is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to IEP meetings. We're all in this new world of having to have our IEP meetings hosted virtually. They're hard enough, so navigating them via computer is going to be a new thing for us. So anyway, I'll just hand this off to Nancy.
Okay, thanks. I will tell you, I did attend a meeting this morning, a virtual meeting, and it went very well. So that's the good news. And the virtual meetings aren't really that different. In fact, in some ways they might be better because you can get some of your specialists to attend that might not be able to attend other meetings. But I'm just going to start off and go through what's required in an IEP and some questions for parents to look at when it's time for the IEP. The first one is, did you get a meeting notice? More and more teachers are forgetting to send that meeting notice, and it really needs to be sent before the meeting. And parents, you need to respond. And what's happening now during the virtual meetings in one school system is the meeting notice is sent, and then you sign it and you scan it and send it back. But if you don't have the ability to do that, then you can keep the meeting notice, sign it, hold on to it, and send an email that you received the meeting notice and that you agree to attend. Now, if the time isn't convenient, it's fine for you to suggest another time. I talked to one parent earlier that had scheduled their IEP before school was canceled, and that time was not going to be convenient while her child was at home because she needed someone to care for her child. So if you need to reschedule, please do so. Be sure when you look at that meeting notice that all the topics that need to be discussed at the meeting are checked. Sometimes it's not just to review the IEP or to do a new IEP, it's to also do a behavior plan or a functional behavior assessment, or if it's transition services. So just make sure that everything's checked that needs to be checked. The other thing is, if you want to request specialists to attend your meeting, that would be the time to tell the teacher, yes, that's a good date, but I would also like the BCBA to attend, or the speech pathologist, or the OT, or the PT, or all of them. Why not? The thing is, they can have input, but they don't have to stay at the meeting the entire time. So you can get their input, and then they can be off to another meeting virtually. The other thing is, did you fill out a questionnaire? Did your teacher send you some sort of questionnaire or ask for input for your concerns? That needs to be done every year. And you need to make sure there is a box on the profile of the IEP that is specifically for parent concerns. And anything you're concerned about needs to be put in that box. So don't be shy. If you want to type up a paragraph or two, send it to the teacher. She can just copy it and paste it and put it right in. And here's one that I definitely would suggest or almost say is a must, especially during these virtual IEPs. Ask for a draft. If they're scheduling the meeting and it's a week away, say, well, I need to have that draft and I need it not the day before, but in plenty of time for you to review it and to even give the teacher suggestions for changes. She can make those changes, or she could just add it to the agenda to be discussed at the meeting. But the meeting goes a whole lot faster if some of those things are already done. Because believe me, you don't want to get into a 3 or 4 hour meeting virtually. That would be a disaster. I know those are sometimes held at school, but they're really not necessary if you have time to review the IEP and if you know what you're looking for, which we're going to go into next. The next thing on my bullet points were all the concerns addressed in the profile, which I've already addressed that. But when you read that profile, make sure your concerns were put there, because that's really important. And one of the reasons it's important is everything that's put in the IEP needs to be addressed within the body of the IEP. So, were all the instructional factors checked? And that's on the second page of the IEP. There are boxes that need to be checked. And the first two are, does my child have behavior that impedes his or her learning or the learning of others? Well, in my opinion, most of our students with autism do need a behavior goal. They do have behavior. It may not impede others' learning, but it impedes their own learning. And most people think of behavior as hitting, kicking, biting, but that's not really what all encompasses behavior. I mean, behavior can be staring out the window, refusal to do work, any of that. So in my opinion, that box needs to be checked and it needs to be addressed in a goal. A lot of our students need behavior plans.
Nancy, I was going to ask you if you would describe the difference between a behavior plan and a behavior goal.
Okay. A behavior goal is a goal that's written in the IEP that might say the student will remain on task and work for 15 minutes. And you can address it through just working on it in the classroom. Now, a behavior plan is something very much in depth. The teacher can write it. In Huntsville City, a lot of times the BCBA is responsible for writing it. And I will say, I saw one of the best behavior plans I've ever seen this morning. And I complimented the BCBA on it. It was super. And anybody could pick up that behavior plan, whether it's the aide, the teacher, and know exactly what to do. So a behavior plan is more in depth, and it's for a student that really has a lot of behaviors that are interfering with his learning or the learning of others in the classroom. The other things that are on that list is the child have communication needs. Not all students have speech therapy, but sometimes students still have a communication need, even if they don't have speech therapy. A lot of times as this child gets older, the school system gives less and less services, which I'm not necessarily a fan of that, but if you can't get services, you can at least have some of these things addressed in the classroom and with the goal. Let's see, is your child on extended standards or the alternate assessment is one of those questions. So if your child is in more of what we call a self-contained classroom and is on a totally different curriculum, that box needs to be checked. Transportation is also addressed on that page. And if the child needs any support, such as if they're going on a field trip with a regular ed class, and they might need an aide or another teacher or someone to go with them, that's addressed there too. Let's see. Were all the concerns and weaknesses discussed on the profile addressed in the IEP goals and services? A parent talked to me about this recently, because a lot of things were said on the profile, but when she went to look at the goals on the page, they talked about how he wasn't toiling independently, he wasn't doing this, he wasn't able to walk to the cafeteria, to wash his hands, but none of that was addressed in the IEP. So any weakness that's on the profile needs to be addressed in the body of the IEP goal. The other thing was the IEP individualized for the child? I mean, that's the whole point, IEP, Individual Education Plan. But what happens many times, the state has standards that the teachers are required to use. They have regular standards and they have the extended standards. I'm not a huge fan of the new extended standards. I think they're very difficult for the teachers to deal with. You have to be very creative. And one of the things you have to watch for is those standards should not be copied and pasted onto the IEP. One I saw recently was about fractions. And this was for a nonverbal child, and he was supposed to identify 1/2, 1/4, 1/3. And of course, they had him working on it, but I doubt that he had any idea what he was doing. But that could have been changed when they wrote the goal. It could be something very functional, like he loves pizza. So it could be he cuts the pizza, or he gives the piece of pizza to somebody. It's something that's, you just have to think outside the box. But what I see a lot of teachers doing, because it's easy, is they copy and paste that standard. And really it's something that's not even functional for the student. So the IEP, first of all, needs to be functional for the student. Okay, and one of the statements I think I put on this little handout that Jenny sent out, and this is directly from the state. Each IEP must be individualized based on the student's needs. Copying and pasting standards into the goal is not individualized, and it places the LEA, that's the local education agency, in a vulnerable, litigious situation. The IEP must be written to address the student's unique needs and to provide educational benefit within 1 year of the IEP. And within 1 year is also a red flag too, because I had someone speak to me about a therapist that said, well, this child has had these same goals 3 years and they haven't made any progress. Well, this person was blaming the child when actually it's the fault of the person that wrote the goals. If a child is not making any progress toward the goal, it's up to the teacher or therapist to change that goal even before the year is over. So you want to raise the bar high for the child, but not so high that it's not an achievable goal. And it needs to be functional too. And a lot of times by communicating with the parent, you can find the most functional goals, because these are the things the child needs to be doing at school and home also. Another thing is, are the measurable annual goals, both in academic subjects and functional needs, which I've already addressed. Functional needs, of course you need math. The state requires like math, reading, language arts goals. But you also need communication goals, community participation, self-determination, behavior, adaptive behavior. There are other goals that are needed, and there aren't standards for all those goals. So that's up to the teacher to know the child and be able to write an appropriate goal, and to listen to a parent too. For students participating in the alternate assessment, measurable goals have to be written in English language arts, math, and functional skills also. And the goals that are written for those students have to have benchmarks. Now, my thought on benchmarks, they're only required to have 2. I like to have 4, because I like to have one every 9 weeks. that you can measure. So you can ask for that as a parent. And they have to be done in small increments. I also like it when the goal is broken down, not when it says the child will do it at 30%, 40%, 50%. I like that you break a goal down. Say if it was cutting something, they might snip, they might cut a 1-inch piece of paper, they might cut a 2-inch, then you're leading up to the goal. So each teacher does it different, and the state doesn't tell them exactly how to do it, but you have a say-so as a parent, because you need to look at that progress report and see if the child is making progress. Also, it needs to be very measurable, which means if it says the child will do it 80% of the time, that's really not measurable unless somebody's looking at that child measuring it all the time. I mean, you can measure it for small periods of time, but not all day long, unless the child has a one-on-one aid. Even that's impossible. So look for a very measurable goal and benchmark. Let's see, supplemental aids and services. Those are what are added to the IEP. And I have to say, people used to laugh at me because I put a lot of those in there. Well, I did it for other people to look at and say, oh, I'm going to do that. That'll work. I think if you don't put those in there, like breaking the task down into small increments, using visual schedules, using a work system. I've been in an IEP meeting where I said, are you using a schedule? And the person said, well, no, we hadn't set that up yet. Well, I opened the IEP and it said the child would have a schedule. So obviously it wasn't being done. So this is a legal document and it needs to be followed. So most teachers I know, and I will say the meeting I was in this morning, the teacher did an excellent job. So there are some really good teachers, but there's some that aren't as thorough as others. So I think parents are fine. You're the best advocate for your child. So always speak up. And I have a list, if anybody's interested, of supplemental aids and services. I can send that out also, add it to this. Program modifications, typically, yes.
I was just going to say, we can include that in a post.
Typically there aren't, okay. Typically there aren't program modifications. A lot of people think the kids that are most, that have the most disability need modifications, but because they're on the extended standards, their IEP is already written that way. So they don't need modifications. Whereas some students in a regular ed class that may just have a learning disability might need a modification to be able to participate in that class. Related services. That's physical therapy, psychological services, therapeutic recreation, speech and language, occupational therapy, physical therapy, and even school nurse. Our school nurses in Huntsville City, if they even give the child medication, that's written in as a related service. It may be 10 minutes a day where they go to the nurse to get medication. So all of those need to be in the related services boxes there. Let's see. Accommodations for assessments. This is more important for students who need to take the SAT or ACT or any standardized tests. They may need extra time, but they have to have extra time during the regular school day too for any assessment. So you have to be careful there if a parent's asking for extra time. Most school counselors and special ed teachers are familiar with this. A student with a significant disability doesn't necessarily need accommodations because they're built into the alternate assessment. Assistive technology. this is a real big thing. To me, all of our special ed students need this. Even the smallest assistive technology, most people don't realize it, but an adapted chair is assistive technology. A special fork or spoon is an assistive technology. A stander, all of that. Screen magnifier system, all of that is assistive technology. When most people look at assistive technology, they think it's just a communication device, which isn't true. Even the low-tech things like using a picture schedule, that's assistive technology also. And in the next little box on the IEP is support for personnel. And people continually confuse this. They think that means the child's going to have a one-on-one aide, which isn't true. That should be addressed in supplementary aids and services. Support for personnel is training and support that the staff needs in the classroom. Say the BCBA comes in once a month to observe, to make sure the aide or the teacher is keeping data. That's support for personnel. Also, if they come in to do any training, like if a child has autism and the teacher needs specific training in that area, that's where that can be written in. A lot of systems are reluctant to do this, but I think it's important, because if your staff isn't trained, then the student's not getting what they need. The next thing is ESY. And ESY this year is complicated. I don't know what's going to happen. I just heard that it may continue, but in the same way it's happening now. A parent can opt out, but if the child qualifies, they can still have what the instruction is looking like now, which would be the teacher online sending packets, the therapist online. I've heard some really good things that are happening, and then I've heard of some that aren't really going well. So it's going to be up to the parent to accept that or not. But I don't think there'll be any ESY programs in schools just because of the limitations on groups in the schools. The IEP signature, a lot of people have asked about that. Well, how am I going to sign? And there are ways to do the signing, but evidently the school systems, some may have done it, but the one that I've worked with recently did not. And what they did is the same thing we do if we have someone attending by phone. The names are typed in, and the meeting I watched today, I was able to look at the teacher typing everything in, and then in parentheses she said attended on Google Meet, and then they would sign the IEP, they said, after school begins. But I think it's still okay if they don't sign it. One thing I would say is to try not to get upset. If you do and you don't want to continue with the meeting, you need to get consensus with the group and say, look, I need to think about this. My child is in the background crying and I need to stop this meeting. And you need to get consensus from the group, because if there's some disagreement and you say, I'm not going to discuss this anymore, and you hang up and you're out of the meeting, they can finish the meeting, sign the IEP, and it's done. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't come back and say, I want another meeting. You can do that at any point. Always put it in writing. I would like an IEP meeting, and it has to be scheduled in a timely manner. So, any questions?